In the humid spring of 1847, Savannah's elite society operated under unspoken codes that governed life, death, and everything in between. Among the grand Georgian mansions and sprawling cotton warehouses along the Savannah River, power wasn't just measured in acres or shipping contracts, but in the absolute control over human souls. This is the story of a delicate gold chain that became an instrument of liberation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A tale of patience wrapped in silk gloves, calculated rebellion disguised as servitude, and the razor-thin boundary between submission and revolt. A story that began with a young house slave named Isabella, a treasured timepiece, and 19 years of accumulated rage simmering beneath a porcelain smile. What transpired at Magnolia Heights Estate during that balmy April evening of 1847 would forever alter how Savannah's high society viewed the delicate threads that bound their world together. The events I'm about to share remain sealed in whispered confessions and deathbed revelations for generations. When the truth finally surfaced through faded letters and forgotten testimonies, it painted a picture so methodical, so precisely orchestrated, that it challenged everything we thought we knew about resistance in the antebellum South. Because Isabella's method of settling her score was so intimate, so personal, that it took decades before anyone understood the true significance of that golden chain. The spring of 1847 brought unprecedented prosperity to Savannah's merchant class, and nowhere was this wealth more evident than at Magnolia Heights Estate. The three-story Georgian mansion, with its soaring white columns and wraparound porches draped in Spanish moss, stood as a monument to Theodore Whitmore's success in the cotton trade. The estate sprawled across 200 acres along the Savannah River, its prosperity built on the backs of 37 enslaved souls and the strategic shipping contracts that made Theodore one of Georgia's most influential merchants. Theodore Whitmore commanded respect through a combination of calculated charm and underlying menace that kept both business partners and slaves in careful submission. At 52, he had built his empire through shrewd negotiations and an unwavering belief that absolute control was the foundation of prosperity. His daily routine revolved around the gold pocket watch that had belonged to his father, a timepiece he consulted obsessively and polished with religious devotion. The watch, suspended from a delicate gold chain, had become his signature accessory, gleaming against his silk waistcoats as he conducted business or surveyed his domain. The mansion itself reflected Theodore's obsession with order and precision. Every room was arranged according to his specific requirements, every servant trained to anticipate his needs before he voiced them. The morning routine began at precisely 6 o'clock when Isabella would enter his private study to prepare his coffee and arrange his correspondence. She moved through these tasks with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to become invisible while remaining indispensable. Isabella Marie had lived her entire 19 years within the confines of Magnolia Heights, born into servitude in the small cabin behind the main house where her mother Patience had labored until consumption claimed her 3 winters prior. Unlike the field hands who worked the cotton warehouses and loading docks, Isabella had been selected at age 12 to serve in the main house, her quick intelligence and natural elegance making her suitable for the delicate work of maintaining Theodore's private spaces. Her daily responsibilities extended far beyond simple housekeeping. Isabella managed Theodore's personal correspondence, arranged his business meetings, and maintained the meticulous organization of his private study where he conducted his most sensitive financial dealings. She possessed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate his moods and needs, appearing with fresh coffee when his temper began to rise during difficult negotiations, or quietly adjusting the lamplight when he spent long evenings reviewing shipping manifests. Theodore's trust in Isabella was absolute, built over 7 years of flawless service that never once betrayed a hint of rebellion or discontent. He often boasted to visitors about his remarkable housegirl who could read and write better than many white women, who understood the complexities of his business operations, and who demonstrated the kind of loyalty that proved his theories about proper slave management. Isabella's literacy was Theodore's particular pride as he had personally overseen her education, viewing it as evidence of his enlightened approach to slave ownership. What Theodore never recognized was that Isabella's education had become her greatest weapon. She could read not only his correspondence but also the subtle signs of his character, the patterns of his behavior, and the vulnerabilities hidden beneath his veneer of absolute control. During the countless hours she spent in his study, organizing his papers and cleaning his personal effects, Isabella absorbed every detail of Theodore's life with the precision of a scholar studying a particularly complex text. The study itself was Theodore's sanctuary, a room where he felt completely secure in his privacy. Mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes on commerce, philosophy, and Southern literature. His massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface always arranged with mathematical precision. The pocket watch held a place of honor on a small silver stand beside his inkwell, its gold chain coiled in a perfect spiral that Isabella was required to maintain exactly as Theodore preferred. Every morning Isabella would polish the watch with a special cloth Theodore had imported from London, carefully cleaning each link of the chain until it gleamed like liquid gold in the morning sunlight that streamed through the tall windows. This ritual had become so routine that Theodore rarely watched her perform it, trusting her completely to handle his most treasured possession with the reverence it deserved. The pocket watch represented more than mere timekeeping to Theodore. It was a symbol of his family's legacy and his own success in expanding that legacy. He would often hold it while making important business decisions, running his thumb along the smooth gold case as he contemplated shipping routes or contract negotiations. The watch had been present at every significant moment of his adult life, from his first major cotton purchase to his marriage to the late Margaret Whitmore, who had died giving birth to their son Marcus 8 years into their union. Theodore's relationship with his children reflected the same controlling nature that governed every aspect of his life. Marcus, now 28, had been groomed from childhood to inherit the family business, though his natural cruelty often exceeded even his father's calculated coldness. Catherine, 22 and recently returned from a northern finishing school, had begun to demonstrate disturbing signs of sympathy for the enslaved population, much to Theodore's growing concern. The household dynamics had shifted significantly since Catherine's return from Philadelphia, where exposure to different social philosophies had planted seeds of doubt about the moral foundations of her family's wealth. Her questions about slave treatment, and her visible discomfort during punishment sessions created tension that rippled through the entire estate. Theodore viewed his daughter's newfound conscience as a temporary aberration that would be corrected through proper exposure to Southern realities. Isabella observed these family tensions with the keen awareness of someone whose survival depended on reading the subtle currents of white emotion. She recognized that Catherine's moral awakening posed both opportunity and danger, as any disruption to the established order could result in stricter surveillance or changes that might threaten the careful plans that had been forming in Isabella's mind for months. The servants' quarters behind the main house buzzed with constant activity, but Isabella's position as head house slave afforded her unique privileges that set her apart from the field hands and kitchen workers. She had her own small room adjacent to the main house, connected by a narrow hallway that allowed her to respond quickly to Theodore's summons. This proximity had given her unparalleled access to family conversations, business negotiations, and private moments that revealed the true nature of the Whitmore family dynamics. Ruth, the head cook who had worked at Magnolia Heights for nearly 2 decades, served as Isabella's closest confidant and surrogate mother figure since Patience's death. Ruth possessed the kind of wisdom that came from surviving years of careful observation, and she had recognized something dangerous brewing in Isabella's quiet demeanor. The two women often worked together in the early morning hours before the family awakened, their conversations conducted in the careful code that all enslaved people learned to speak when discussing forbidden thoughts. During these dawn conversations, Ruth had begun to notice subtle changes in Isabella's behavior that suggested a fundamental shift in her relationship with servitude. Where once Isabella had displayed genuine pride in her efficiency and skill, Ruth now detected a calculating coldness that manifested in the way Isabella handled Theodore's personal belongings. There was something too careful, too deliberate about how Isabella touched his things, as if she were memorizing details for purposes Ruth didn't want to contemplate. The spring social season brought additional complications to Magnolia Heights as Theodore prepared to host a series of business entertainments designed to solidify his position in Savannah's merchant community. These gatherings required extensive preparation, with Isabella coordinating every detail from menu planning to guest accommodations. The increased activity
Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Created both additional stress and new opportunities, as the constant flow of visitors meant less routine surveillance and more chances for private conversations among the servants. Benjamin, the young stable hand who managed Theodore's horses and carriages, had developed feelings for Isabella that went far beyond the casual friendships typically formed among enslaved people. At 21, Benjamin possessed the kind of quiet strength and loyalty that made him valuable to both the Whitmore family and the servant community. His position required him to travel frequently between Magnolia Heights and Savannah proper, giving him access to information and connections that other slaves lacked. Isabella had begun to cultivate Benjamin's devotion with the same calculated precision she applied to all her relationships. She recognized that his feelings for her, combined with his mobility and access to the stables, made him a potentially valuable ally in any plan that might require coordination beyond the immediate confines of the estate. Their conversations during his evening visits to the servants' quarters had taken on an increasingly serious tone as Isabella began testing his willingness to take risks for her sake. The relationship between Isabella and Benjamin developed against the backdrop of increasing tension in the main house as Theodore struggled to maintain control over his changing family dynamics. Marcus had begun drinking heavily and gambling with increasing recklessness, creating financial pressures that threatened the stability Theodore had worked decades to achieve. Catherine's continued questions about slave treatment had escalated to open criticism of specific plantation practices, forcing Theodore to consider more drastic measures to restore proper family hierarchy. These mounting pressures created an atmosphere of instability that Isabella recognized as potentially advantageous to her evolving plans. Theodore's attention was increasingly divided between managing his son's destructive behavior and correcting his daughter's dangerous sympathies, leaving him less focused on the day-to-day operations that had always been his primary concern. This distraction represented the kind of opportunity Isabella had been waiting for, but it also required perfect timing and flawless execution to avoid the catastrophic consequences of discovery. The pocket watch continued to mark the rhythm of Theodore's days with mechanical precision, its steady ticking a constant reminder of his control over time, schedules, and human lives. Isabella's daily ritual of cleaning and maintaining the timepiece had become so automatic that Theodore no longer watched her perform it, trusting her completely to handle his most precious possession with appropriate care. This trust would prove to be the fatal flaw in Theodore's otherwise careful management of his personal security. As April progressed toward the social season's most important gatherings, Isabella began to finalize the details of a plan that had been developing in her mind since her mother's death 3 years prior. The combination of family instability, seasonal distractions, and her unique access to Theodore's private spaces created a convergence of circumstances that might never occur again. The gold chain that had symbolized Theodore's power and precision would soon become the instrument of his destruction, wielded by the very hands he had trained to serve his every need. Part 2. Thematic Foundation and Engagement. The delicate balance of power at Magnolia Heights rested on invisible threads of fear, loyalty, and carefully maintained illusions that could snap without warning. Within the elegant confines of Theodore Whitmore's estate, justice wore many faces, and freedom took forms that polite society preferred not to acknowledge. The spring of 1847 would test every assumption about control, revealing how quickly the hunter could become the hunted when the prey possessed intelligence, patience, and access to the hunter's most vulnerable moments. Isabella's story illuminates themes that extend far beyond the boundaries of one Georgia estate. It speaks to the universal human capacity for transformation under extreme pressure, the way oppression can forge instruments of liberation from the very tools meant to enforce submission, and the profound truth that those who appear most powerless often possess the greatest potential for decisive action. Her tale reveals how resilience can masquerade as compliance, how intelligence can be weaponized through seeming servitude, and how the most intimate acts of rebellion can emerge from years of enforced proximity to power. The mansion at Magnolia Heights stood as a monument to Theodore's belief in the natural order of superiority and submission, yet within its walls lived a young woman whose mind had been sharpened by the very education meant to make her a more valuable servant. Isabella's literacy had become both her shield and her sword, allowing her to read not only Theodore's correspondence, but also the deeper patterns of his character, the rhythms of his vulnerability, and the precise moments when his guard would be lowered enough to allow for decisive action. The psychological landscape of antebellum Georgia created specific conditions that shaped both oppressor and oppressed in ways that would prove crucial to the events unfolding at Magnolia Heights. Theodore's generation had inherited slavery as an established institution, viewing it not as a moral choice but as an economic necessity that required careful management to remain profitable and stable. This perspective had led him to develop sophisticated methods of psychological control that went far beyond physical coercion, creating bonds of dependency and loyalty that he believed made his slaves genuinely grateful for their positions. Isabella had grown up understanding these psychological mechanisms with a clarity that would have terrified Theodore had he recognized it. She had learned to read the subtle signs of his emotional state, to anticipate his needs before he voiced them, and to present herself as the perfect embodiment of grateful servitude, while maintaining an inner life that remained completely hidden from his perception. This dual existence had required tremendous emotional discipline, but it had also given her insights into Theodore's character that no one else possessed. The spring social season brought additional layers of complexity to the already intricate dynamics of the household. Theodore's business required him to maintain relationships with other merchants, plantation owners and shipping contractors whose own success depended on the continued stability of the slave system. These men shared stories, strategies and warnings about managing their human property, creating an informal network of surveillance and control that extended far beyond individual estates. Isabella's position as head house slave meant she was often present during these gatherings, serving refreshments and maintaining the elegant atmosphere that Theodore required for his business entertaining. These occasions provided her with unprecedented access to conversations about slave management techniques, market conditions that affected slave values, and political developments that might threaten the stability of the entire system. The information she gathered during these social functions had begun to shape her understanding of the broader context within which her personal situation existed. The psychological toll of maintaining her facade of loyalty while absorbing constant reminders of her commodified status had created an internal pressure that Isabella recognized would eventually require release. She had watched other slaves break under similar strain, some retreating into madness, others attempting futile escapes that resulted in brutal punishment or death. Isabella's intelligence had shown her that neither madness nor flight offered viable solutions to her situation, leading her to consider alternatives that required different forms of courage and calculation. Theodore's obsession with his pocket watch reflected a deeper need for control over time itself, a desire to impose his will on the fundamental rhythms of existence. The daily ritual of consulting the timepiece, adjusting its chain and polishing its surface represented his attempt to assert mastery over forces that ultimately remained beyond human control. Isabella had observed this ritual thousands of times, noting the almost religious devotion with which Theodore handled the watch and the visible anxiety he displayed when separated from it even briefly. The gold chain that suspended the watch had become in Isabella's mind a symbol of the invisible bonds that connected all relationships at Magnolia Heights. Theodore believed the chain represented his connection to family legacy and commercial success, but Isabella saw it as an emblem of the connections between oppressor and oppressed, the links that bound their fates together in ways neither fully understood. The chain's beauty disguised its fundamental function as an instrument of constraint, much like the elegant mansion that housed a system of human bondage. Isabella's growing awareness of these symbolic connections had begun to influence her daily interactions with Theodore's personal possessions. She found herself studying the chain with increasing intensity, noting its weight, its flexibility and the precise mechanics of how it attached to the watch. These observations appeared to be simply the attention to detail that Theodore valued in her work, but they reflected a deeper analysis of the object's potential beyond its intended function. The servant community at Magnolia Heights had developed its own complex social structure that reflected both the imposed hierarchies of slavery and the natural relationships that formed among people sharing common circumstances. Isabella's position as head house slave placed her at the intersection of these formal and informal networks, giving her influence that extended throughout the estate's enslaved population. This influence had been earned through years of demonstrating reliability, intelligence, and genuine concern for the welfare of other servants. Ruth's role as head cook made her Isabella's closest ally in the complex political landscape of the servant quarters. The older woman had survived decades of slavery by developing an acute sensitivity to danger and an ability to read the emotional currents that flowed through the household. Ruth had begun to sense fundamental changes in Isabella's demeanor that suggested something significant was approaching, though the younger woman had not yet revealed the specific nature of her evolving plans. Benjamin's position as stable hand gave him access to information about Theodore's travel plans, business appointments, and the daily rhythms of activity that governed life at Magnolia Heights. His growing emotional attachment to Isabella had made him increasingly willing to share information that might seem insignificant to him but could prove crucial to someone planning actions that required precise timing and detailed knowledge of household routines. The relationship between Isabella and Benjamin had evolved beyond simple attraction into a partnership based on mutual recognition of each other's intelligence and potential for resistance. Benjamin's travels between the estate and Savannah proper had exposed him to conversations among free blacks and sympathetic whites that revealed the existence of networks dedicated to helping enslaved people escape or resist their circumstances. This knowledge had begun to influence his perspective on the possibilities available to those bold enough to take extraordinary risks. Part 3. World Building and Context. The economic foundation of Savannah's prosperity in 1847 rested on a complex network of cotton production, shipping, and international trade that connected Georgia plantations to textile mills in England and New England. Theodore Whitmore's position within this system depended on his ability to coordinate the movement of cotton from interior plantations to Savannah's port facilities, where his warehouses served as crucial staging areas for the global cotton trade. This business required him to maintain relationships with plantation owners, ship captains, insurance brokers, and international buyers whose own success depended on the continued stability of slave labor. The physical layout of Magnolia Heights reflected the sophisticated infrastructure required to support Theodore's commercial operations. The estate's location along the Savannah River provided direct access to the shipping channels that connected the interior cotton regions to international markets. Warehouses, loading docks, and administrative buildings clustered around the main house, creating a complex that functioned as both private residence and commercial headquarters. Isabella's daily responsibilities included maintaining correspondence with business partners throughout the region and coordinating the logistical details that kept Theodore's operation running smoothly. This work had given her comprehensive knowledge of cotton market conditions, shipping schedules, and the financial relationships that sustained the entire system. She understood how seasonal variations in crop yields affected pricing, how international political developments influenced demand, and how the constant fear of slave rebellions created insurance costs that factored into every business calculation. The legal framework that governed slavery in Georgia had evolved over decades to address every conceivable aspect of human ownership, from inheritance laws that treated slaves as property to criminal codes that defined punishment for various forms of resistance. Theodore kept extensive records of his slave holdings, including detailed documentation of each person's skills, health status, and estimated market value. These records were maintained in his private study, where Isabella had access to information about not only her own commodified status but also the economic calculations that determined the fate of every person enslaved at Magnolia Heights. The psychological mechanisms that sustained slavery extended far beyond legal codes and economic incentives to include cultural narratives that justified human bondage as natural, beneficial, and ordained by divine authority. Theodore's personal library contained numerous volumes that provided intellectual justification for slavery, including works of political philosophy, religious texts, and scientific treatises that purported to demonstrate the inherent inferiority of African peoples. Isabella's literacy had given her access to these materials, allowing her to understand the ideological framework that Theodore used to justify his actions to himself and others. The social rituals that governed interaction between whites and enslaved people at Magnolia Heights reflected centuries of cultural development designed to reinforce hierarchical relationships through daily practice. These rituals extended from formal protocols for addressing white family members to subtle rules about eye contact, physical proximity, and the expression of emotion. Isabella had mastered these social codes with such perfection that her compliance appeared completely natural, but her understanding of their artificial nature had become a source of inner resistance that grew stronger with each passing day. The religious landscape of antebellum Georgia included both slaveholder Christianity that justified human bondage and alternative spiritual traditions that sustained hope for liberation among enslaved communities. Theodore required his slaves to attend Sunday services at St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church, where they heard sermons emphasizing obedience, humility, and acceptance of their earthly circumstances. However, the servant quarters also hosted evening gatherings where different spiritual perspectives could be shared through songs, stories, and prayers that spoke to deeper human longings for freedom and justice. Isabella's relationship with religion had become increasingly complex as her education exposed her to contradictions between Christian teachings about human dignity and the practical reality of her enslavement. She had learned to navigate these contradictions by developing a private spiritual life that drew strength from sources Theodore would have found threatening had he recognized their influence on her thinking. This inner spiritual development had contributed to her growing sense of agency and purpose that would prove crucial to her eventual actions. The economic pressures that affected Theodore's business created ripple effects throughout the household that Isabella observed with growing interest. Market fluctuations that reduced profit margins led to cost-cutting measures that affected everything from food rations for slaves to maintenance of estate buildings. Political developments that threatened the expansion of slavery into new territories created anxiety among slaveholders that manifested in increased surveillance and harsher punishment for minor infractions. Isabella's access to Theodore's business correspondence had given her insights into the financial vulnerabilities that affected even the most successful slaveholders. She understood how Theodore's wealth depended on maintaining credit relationships with northern banks whose own policies were influenced by anti-slavery sentiment. She knew about insurance policies that covered slave property against death, injury, or escape, and she understood how these financial instruments created economic incentives that shaped decisions about slave treatment and security. The technological developments that were beginning to transform transportation and communication in the 1840s created new opportunities and challenges for slaveholders like Theodore. Steamship travel had made it possible to move cotton to markets more quickly and efficiently, but it had also made it easier for escaped slaves to reach free territories. Telegraph lines that connected major cities allowed for rapid communication about business conditions, but they also enabled the coordination of anti-slavery activities across wider geographic areas. Isabella's position at the center of Theodore's information networks had given her awareness of these broader technological and social changes that were reshaping the world beyond Magnolia Heights. She understood that the slave system was under increasing pressure from multiple directions and that the stability Theodore took for granted was more fragile than he recognized. This knowledge had influenced her thinking about the timing and methods that might prove most effective for actions designed to challenge the existing order. The cultural traditions that sustained resistance within enslaved communities included sophisticated methods of communication that allowed information to travel quickly throughout networks of connected plantations and urban slave populations. Isabella had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when news was being passed through these informal channels, and she had begun to contribute her own information about conditions at Magnolia Heights to the broader flow of intelligence that helped enslaved people make informed decisions about their circumstances. The seasonal rhythms that governed agricultural and commercial activity in Georgia created predictable patterns of increased and decreased surveillance that experienced slaves learned to exploit for various purposes. Isabella had studied these patterns for years, noting how spring planting and fall harvest seasons affected the attention paid to household activities, how social seasons created distractions that reduced normal vigilance, and how weather conditions could provide cover for actions that required privacy and concealment. Part 4. Primary antagonist introduction. Theodore Whitmore represented the epitome of antebellum Southern gentility, a man whose refined manners and cultured speech masked a worldview that reduced human beings to economic calculations and property assessments. At 52, he had spent 3 decades building his commercial empire through a combination of shrewd business acumen and an unwavering commitment to the principles of racial hierarchy that sustained his society's economic foundation. His success had reinforced his conviction that slavery represented not merely an economic necessity but a positive good that provided order, stability, and appropriate governance for people he believed incapable of self-direction. Theodore's daily routine reflected his obsession with precision and control that extended from his business operations to every aspect of household management. He arose each morning at precisely 6 o'clock, began his day with coffee prepared to exact specifications, and reviewed his correspondence according to a rigid schedule that had remained unchanged for years. This predictability had become both a source of efficiency and a potential vulnerability, though Theodore's confidence in his security had blinded him to the possibility that his routines might be studied and exploited by those he trusted most completely. The education that had shaped Theodore's character included classical training in literature, philosophy, and rhetoric that provided him with intellectual frameworks for justifying slavery as part of the natural order of human society. He could quote Greek philosophers on the necessity of hierarchical relationships, cite biblical passages that appeared to sanction human bondage, and reference contemporary scientific theories that purported to demonstrate racial differences in intelligence and moral capacity. This intellectual foundation had given him unshakable confidence in the righteousness of his position and the legitimacy of his authority over other human beings. Theodore's approach to slave management reflected his belief that psychological control was more effective than physical coercion alone. He had developed sophisticated methods of manipulation that created emotional bonds between himself and his slaves, encouraging them to view their service as privilege rather than oppression and to compete for his approval through demonstrations of loyalty and efficiency. This system had proven remarkably effective in preventing resistance and escape attempts, while also increasing the productivity and reliability of his enslaved workforce. The pocket watch that had become Theodore's most treasured possession represented multiple layers of meaning that he himself only partially understood. On the surface, it was a practical tool that helped him maintain the precise scheduling that his business required. More deeply, it symbolized his connection to family tradition and his father's success in establishing the foundation for the Whitmore fortune. Most significantly, it represented his belief in his ability to control time itself, to impose his will on the fundamental rhythms of existence through superior intelligence and determination. Theodore's relationship with the pocket watch bordered on superstition, though he would have rejected such a characterization as beneath his rational nature. He consulted the timepiece before making important business decisions, carried it during crucial negotiations, and felt genuine anxiety when circumstances forced him to be separated from it even briefly. The daily ritual of winding and polishing the watch had become a form of meditation that helped him organize his thoughts and reinforce his sense of control over his environment. The gold chain that suspended the watch had been crafted by a master jeweler in Charleston according to Theodore's precise specifications. Each link had been individually forged and tested to ensure both beauty and strength, creating an object that reflected Theodore's belief in the importance of combining aesthetic appeal with practical function. The chain's weight and flexibility had been calculated to provide the perfect balance between security and ease of access, allowing Theodore to consult the watch quickly while ensuring that it remained safely attached to his person. Theodore's treatment of his family reflected the same controlling impulses that governed his approach to slave management, though the methods necessarily differed due to social constraints that limited his authority over white dependents. His late wife Margaret had learned to navigate his need for control through careful accommodation of his preferences and avoidance of direct confrontation, but their children had proven more challenging to manage as they developed independent thoughts and desires that sometimes conflicted with his expectations. Marcus, Theodore's son and heir, had inherited many of his father's worst characteristics while lacking the intelligence and self-discipline that had made Theodore successful. The young man's cruelty toward slaves exceeded even Theodore's calculated harshness, manifesting in random acts of violence that served no purpose beyond the satisfaction of his own sadistic impulses. This behavior concerned Theodore not from moral perspective but because it threatened the psychological equilibrium that his management system required to function effectively. Catherine's return from her northern education had introduced dangerous variables into the household dynamic that Theodore was still learning to address. Her exposure to abolitionist ideas had created sympathy for enslaved people that manifested in questions about plantation practices and visible discomfort during punishment sessions. Theodore viewed his daughter's moral awakening as a form of contamination that required careful treatment to prevent it from spreading to other family members or becoming known in the broader community. The business relationships that sustained Theodore's commercial success required him to maintain a reputation for reliability, intelligence and appropriate social attitudes that reinforced his standing within Savannah's merchant community. His ability to manage his slave holdings without significant incidents of resistance or escape had become part of his commercial brand, demonstrating to potential partners that he possessed the competence and authority necessary for large-scale business operations. Theodore's private study served as the command center for both his business empire and his household management, a space where he could retreat from social obligations to focus on the detailed planning that his success required. The room's arrangement reflected his personality and priorities, with business documents organized according to complex filing systems, personal correspondence sorted by priority and urgency, and slave records maintained with the same meticulous attention to detail that he applied to inventory management of any other valuable property. The security measures that Theodore had implemented to protect his study and personal belongings reflected his awareness that his position made him a potential target for theft or sabotage. However, these precautions focused primarily on external threats from strangers or disgruntled business associates, failing to account for the possibility that someone with legitimate access to his private spaces might harbor hostile intentions. His complete trust in Isabella's loyalty had created a blind spot in his security awareness that would prove catastrophic to his personal safety. Theodore's philosophical framework for understanding human nature had been shaped by his experience as a slaveholder and his need to justify the system that provided his wealth and status. He believed that most people required external authority to provide direction and meaning for their lives, and that the hierarchical relationships of slavery actually benefited enslaved people by relieving them of burdens of responsibility they were incapable of bearing. This worldview had made it impossible for him to recognize the intelligence and agency that Isabella possessed, leading him to mistake her strategic compliance for genuine contentment. The political pressures that were beginning to challenge the stability of slavery in the 1840s had created anxiety among slaveholders like Theodore, who recognized that their entire way of life depended on maintaining systems that were coming under increasing attack from multiple directions. Theodore's responses to these pressures had included increased vigilance about potential sources of resistance within his own holdings and careful attention to political developments that might affect the legal framework supporting human bondage. Part 5. Protagonist positioning. Isabella Marie's position as head house slave at Magnolia Heights represented a unique convergence of privilege and vulnerability that had shaped every aspect of her development since childhood. Her access to education, fine clothing and the elegant spaces of the main house had set her apart from field hands and kitchen workers, but these apparent advantages came with the constant pressure of performing gratitude for circumstances that remained fundamentally degrading and dangerous. This contradiction had created a complex psychological landscape that required tremendous strength to navigate without losing either her sanity or her sense of personal dignity. The literacy that Theodore had provided as part of Isabella's training had become a double-edged gift that opened worlds of knowledge while simultaneously revealing the full extent of her commodified status within society. Through access to books, newspapers, and correspondence, Isabella had developed understanding of political developments, economic conditions, and philosophical debates that few enslaved people possessed. This knowledge had given her perspective on her own situation that was both empowering and terrifying, as it revealed possibilities for resistance while also making clear the enormous risks that any form of rebellion would entail. Isabella's beauty had been both asset and liability throughout her adolescence, attracting favorable attention from the Whitmore family while also making her a potential target for sexual exploitation that constantly threatened enslaved women. Her intelligence had helped her navigate these dangers by learning to present herself in ways that emphasized her value as a skilled worker while minimizing her appeal as a sexual object. This careful self-presentation had required constant vigilance and strategic thinking that had contributed to her overall development as someone capable of complex planning and execution. The death of Isabella's mother 3 years prior had marked a fundamental turning point in her psychological development, removing the last emotional anchor that had connected her to acceptance of her circumstances. Patience had been a woman of remarkable resilience who had found ways to maintain hope and dignity despite decades of enslavement, and her loss had forced Isabella to confront the reality that compliance and loyalty offered no protection against the arbitrary cruelties that slavery imposed on its victims. This recognition had begun the process of transformation that would eventually lead to her decision to take decisive action against her oppressors. Isabella's relationship with her younger brother Samuel had become increasingly strained as she developed awareness of the limited future that awaited him regardless of his talents or character. Samuel's work in the cotton warehouses had exposed him to the harshest aspects of Theodore's operation, and Isabella had watched him struggle with the physical demands and psychological pressures that were breaking his spirit despite his youth and natural strength. Her growing desire to protect Samuel from further degradation had become one of the driving forces behind her evolving plans for resistance. The special access that Isabella's position provided to Theodore's private spaces had given her unprecedented insight into the mind and character of her oppressor. Through years of maintaining his study, handling his correspondence, and observing his daily routines, she had developed understanding of his psychological vulnerabilities that no one else possessed. This knowledge had revealed that Theodore's apparent strength and confidence masked deep insecurities and dependencies that could potentially be exploited by someone with sufficient courage and careful planning. Isabella's mastery of the social codes that governed interaction between slaves and their owners had become so complete that her compliance appeared effortless and natural to those who observed her. However, this performance required tremendous emotional discipline and had created internal pressure that grew stronger with each passing day. The psychological toll of maintaining her facade while absorbing constant reminders of her dehumanized status had begun to manifest in subtle changes that only those closest to her had begun to notice. The education that Theodore had provided to make Isabella a more valuable servant had included exposure to literature, history, and philosophy that contained ideas about justice, dignity, and resistance that slaveholders generally preferred to keep from enslaved people. Isabella had learned to extract dangerous knowledge from seemingly safe sources, finding inspiration in stories of ancient heroes, biblical figures who challenged unjust authority, and historical examples of people who had overthrown oppressive systems through courage and strategic thinking. Isabella's understanding of Theodore's business operations had given her comprehensive knowledge of the economic relationships that sustained slavery throughout the region. She knew which plantations were experiencing financial difficulties, which merchants were expanding their operations, and which political developments were creating anxiety among slaveholders. This information had helped her understand that the slave system was more fragile than its defenders acknowledged and that individual acts of resistance could have consequences that extended far beyond their immediate targets. The network of relationships that Isabella had developed within the servant community had positioned her as an informal leader whose opinions and decisions influenced others throughout the estate. This influence had been earned through years of demonstrating reliability, intelligence, and genuine concern for the welfare of her fellow slaves, but it also represented a resource that could potentially be mobilized to support actions that required coordination and cooperation among multiple people. Isabella's growing relationship with Benjamin had introduced romantic and emotional dimensions to her life that complicated her decision-making while also providing potential support for actions that would require assistance from someone she could trust completely. Benjamin's feelings for her had made him increasingly willing to take risks on her behalf, but Isabella's awareness of the dangers involved had created internal conflict between her desire to protect him and her need for an ally who could provide crucial assistance. The seasonal rhythms of estate life had given Isabella detailed knowledge of when surveillance was most and least intensive, when Theodore's attention was focused on business rather than household management, and when opportunities might arise for actions that required privacy and careful timing. This understanding had become crucial to her planning as she considered various options for resistance that might avoid the immediate detection that would lead to catastrophic punishment. Isabella's analysis of Theodore's psychological relationship with his pocket watch had revealed what she believed to be his greatest vulnerability. Her daily observations of his handling of the timepiece had shown her that it represented far more than mere practical convenience, functioning instead as a psychological anchor that helped him maintain his sense of control and authority. This insight had begun to influence her thinking about methods that might prove most effective for actions designed to challenge his power in the most personal and devastating way possible. The transformation that had been occurring within Isabella's mind and spirit over the past 3 years had reached a point where continued compliance felt more dangerous than resistance. The psychological pressure of maintaining her facade while planning actions that would require her to risk everything had created internal tension that she recognized could not be sustained indefinitely. The approaching social season would provide the cover and distraction necessary for decisive action, but it would also represent her last opportunity to act before the psychological strain became unbearable. Isabella's understanding of the broader context within which her individual situation existed had convinced her that personal liberation could only be achieved through actions that challenged the fundamental assumptions about power and control that sustained the entire system. Her plan had evolved beyond simple escape or revenge to encompass a form of resistance that would force everyone who knew her story to confront uncomfortable truths about the relationships between oppressor and oppressed, master and servant, and the thin lines that separated civilization from brutality. Part 6. Daily life and system of oppression. The rhythm of life at Magnolia Heights followed patterns established through decades of careful refinement, each day beginning before dawn with the tolling of the brass bell that summoned the enslaved population to another cycle of labor, surveillance, and psychological endurance. Isabella's position as head house slave meant her duties commenced even earlier than those of the field hands, as she was expected to have Theodore's study prepared and his morning coffee ready before he descended from his private chambers at precisely 6 o'clock each morning. The elaborate morning ritual that Theodore required reflected his need to begin each day with confirmation of his absolute authority over every aspect of his environment. Isabella would enter his study at 5:30, lighting the oil lamps with practiced efficiency while ensuring that each flame cast exactly the right amount of illumination across his mahogany desk. The temperature of the room had to be adjusted through careful manipulation of the fireplace damper, the morning newspapers arranged in precise order of importance, and his personal correspondence sorted according to categories that Theodore had established years before and never felt compelled to explain to anyone else. The coffee preparation alone involved 17 distinct steps that Isabella had memorized through repetition and reinforcement, from the specific blend of beans that had to be ground to exact consistency to the precise temperature at which the water must be heated before brewing could commence. Theodore's palate had become so refined through years of having his preferences catered to without question that any deviation from the established routine would result in immediate detection and consequences that Isabella had learned to avoid through meticulous attention to details that seemed insignificant to outsiders, but represented the difference between approval and punishment within the carefully controlled environment of the household. The arrangement of Theodore's personal effects required knowledge that went far beyond simple housekeeping, as each object on his desk held specific significance and had to be positioned according to rules that reflected his psychological needs rather than practical considerations. The gold pocket watch occupied the place of honor on its small silver stand, positioned so that Theodore could consult it without moving from his chair, while also ensuring that the morning sunlight would catch the metal surface in a way that reminded him of its beauty and value. The chain had to be coiled in a perfect spiral that Isabella achieved through careful manipulation of each individual link, creating a pattern that appeared effortless but required considerable skill and patience to execute properly. Isabella's access to Theodore's private correspondence had provided her with comprehensive understanding of the business relationships that sustained his commercial empire and the personal anxieties that drove his obsessive need for control over every aspect of his environment. She read every letter before Theodore saw it, noting not only the explicit content but also the subtle indicators of financial pressure, political concern, or social tension that might affect his mood and behavior throughout the day. This knowledge allowed her to anticipate his emotional state and adjust her own performance accordingly, presenting herself as either sympathetic confidant or efficient servant depending on what the circumstances required. The household hierarchy that governed relationships among the enslaved population at Magnolia Heights reflected both the formal structure that Theodore had imposed and the informal networks of mutual support that had developed organically over years of shared experience. Isabella's position at the apex of this hierarchy carried both privileges and responsibilities that complicated her relationships with other slaves while also providing her with influence that could be mobilized for various purposes when circumstances required collective action or mutual protection. Ruth's authority in the kitchen extended throughout the domestic sphere, making her Isabella's primary partner in managing the complex logistics of household operations while also serving as a source of wisdom and emotional support that had become crucial to Isabella's psychological survival. The older woman's experience had taught her to read the subtle signs of impending violence or significant change, and she had begun to notice alterations in Isabella's behavior that suggested something fundamental was shifting in the younger woman's relationship with her circumstances. The punishment protocols that Theodore employed to maintain discipline among his enslaved population had been refined through years of experimentation with different methods of physical and psychological coercion. Public whippings served not only to inflict pain on specific individuals but also to reinforce general awareness of the consequences that awaited anyone who challenged established authority. These spectacles were conducted according to elaborate rituals that maximized their psychological impact while also providing Theodore with opportunities to demonstrate his power and reinforce the submission of his entire enslaved workforce. Isabella had been forced to witness dozens of these punishment sessions over the years, maintaining the impassive expression that was required of all observers while internally recording every detail of Theodore's methods and psychology. She had learned to read the signs that indicated when someone was about to be selected for punishment, understanding the seemingly arbitrary nature of Theodore's decisions while also recognizing the calculated purpose behind actions that appeared driven by momentary anger or impulse. The sexual vulnerabilities that affected all enslaved women at Magnolia Heights created an atmosphere of constant threat that shaped every interaction and relationship within the household. Theodore's apparent lack of personal interest in sexual exploitation did not protect his female slaves from the predatory behavior of his son Marcus or the various white men who visited the estate on business. Isabella's beauty and education made her a particular target for unwanted attention, requiring her to develop sophisticated strategies for deflecting interest while avoiding actions that might be interpreted as disrespectful or resistant. The economic calculations that determined the treatment of enslaved people at Magnolia Heights reflected Theodore's business-oriented approach to human ownership, with decisions about food, clothing, medical care, and living conditions based on cost-benefit analyses that balanced immediate expenses against long-term productivity and asset preservation. Isabella's access to Theodore's financial records had given her detailed knowledge of how these calculations worked, including her own estimated market value and the factors that influenced her worth as both productive worker and potential commodity for future sale. The educational opportunities that Theodore had provided to certain enslaved people served his business interest rather than any humanitarian impulse, with literacy and numeracy skills viewed as investments that increased productivity and reduced the need for white supervision of complex tasks. Isabella's education had far exceeded what Theodore originally intended, as her intelligence and curiosity had led her to absorb knowledge from every available source while maintaining the appearance of focusing only on skills directly related to her assigned duties. The religious observances that Theodore required of his enslaved population served multiple functions within his system of control, providing opportunities for surveillance, while also reinforcing messages about acceptance, obedience, and divine sanction for existing social hierarchies. Isabella's participation in these activities had become increasingly difficult as her understanding of Christian teachings developed beyond the selective interpretations that slaveholders used to justify their actions. The seasonal variations in household routine created predictable patterns of increased and decreased surveillance that experienced slaves learned to exploit for various purposes. Spring social seasons brought additional work but also more opportunities for private conversation, as the increased activity made it difficult for overseers to monitor every interaction. Winter months offered more privacy but also harsher living conditions that made any form of resistance more dangerous and difficult to sustain. The information networks that connected Magnolia Heights to other plantations and urban slave communities provided Isabella with knowledge about conditions elsewhere, escape attempts, political developments, and resistance activities that helped her understand her own situation within a broader context. These networks operated through seemingly innocent interactions among slaves who traveled between properties on various errands, creating communication systems that allowed for rapid dissemination of important information while maintaining plausible deniability about intentional coordination. The psychological toll of maintaining constant vigilance against potential threats while also performing the demanding emotional labor that her position required had begun to manifest in subtle changes that Isabella worked carefully to conceal from white observation. The strain of living with intimate knowledge of her oppressor's vulnerabilities while lacking immediate means to exploit that knowledge had created internal pressure that she recognized would eventually require some form of release, whether through escape, resistance, or psychological breakdown. Part 7. Personal Violation. The transformation of Isabella's worldview began not with a single dramatic incident but through the gradual accumulation of violations that had shaped her existence since childhood, each transgression building upon previous injuries until the collective weight became unbearable. The most devastating of these violations had occurred 3 years prior, when her mother Patience fell victim to the calculated cruelty that Theodore employed to maintain psychological control over his enslaved population, demonstrating that even the most compliant and valuable slaves remained vulnerable to arbitrary punishment whenever their owner's mood or circumstances required a display of absolute power. Patience had served the Whitmore family for over 2 decades, beginning her tenure as a young woman newly arrived from a failed plantation in the South Carolina Low Country, where economic pressures had forced the previous owner to sell his human property to satisfy creditors. Her intelligence and gentle nature had quickly earned her a position in the main house, where she had gradually worked her way up to head seamstress responsible for maintaining the family's extensive wardrobe and household linens. This position had provided her with steady work, relatively comfortable living conditions, and the opportunity to develop skills that made her valuable enough to receive better treatment than field hands or kitchen workers. The relationship between Patience and Isabella had been unusually close by the standards of enslaved families, as Theodore's business interests had been served by allowing the mother and daughter to work together in maintaining his household's elegant appearance. Patience had used every opportunity to educate Isabella in both practical skills and emotional strategies for surviving slavery with dignity and tact, teaching her daughter to read people's motivations, anticipate their needs, and present herself in ways that would maximize her value while minimizing her vulnerability to capricious punishment or unwanted attention. The crisis that destroyed Patience's life began during the winter of 1844, when economic pressures from fluctuating cotton prices forced Theodore to consider cost reduction measures that might affect the comfortable arrangements he had previously maintained for his most valued domestic servants. A series of poor crop yields throughout the region had depressed cotton prices just as Theodore was attempting to expand his shipping operations, creating cash flow problems that required immediate attention to prevent more serious financial difficulties from developing. Theodore's response to these financial pressures included a comprehensive review of all household expenses, with particular attention to costs associated with slave maintenance that might be reduced without significantly affecting productivity or property values. This review had led him to question whether the relatively generous provisions he had made for certain domestic slaves represented necessary business expenses or unnecessary luxuries that could be eliminated to improve his operations' efficiency and profitability. Patience became a target of this cost-cutting initiative when Theodore decided that her position as head seamstress could be eliminated by redistributing her responsibilities among other domestic workers who were already receiving food and housing allowances. This decision reflected not only his immediate financial concerns but also his growing belief that he had been too generous in his treatment of certain slaves, creating expectations that were inconsistent with proper relationships between owners and property. The process of informing Patience about the elimination of her position was designed to serve as an object lesson for other household slaves about the conditional nature of any privileges they might have come to expect. Theodore arranged for the announcement to be made during the weekly gathering where household assignments were reviewed and modified, ensuring that every domestic worker would witness Patience's reaction and understand that their own comfortable circumstances could be withdrawn just as easily and arbitrarily. Patience's response to this devastating news demonstrated the dignity and strength that had made her such an important influence on Isabella's development. Rather than pleading for reconsideration or displaying the emotional breakdown that Theodore clearly expected, she accepted the decision with quiet grace while privately beginning to make arrangements for the dramatic changes that would affect not only her own circumstances but also her daughter's future prospects within the household hierarchy. The practical consequences of losing her position included relocation from the small but comfortable room she had occupied near the main house to cramped quarters in the general slave housing, reduction in food rations to the minimal levels provided to field hands, and assignment to physically demanding outdoor work for which her years of indoor service had left her poorly prepared. These changes would have been difficult for a young person in good health, but for a woman in her 40s who had spent decades performing delicate work in controlled environments, they represented a death sentence disguised as administrative reorganization. Isabella watched her mother's physical and emotional deterioration with growing horror and rage, understanding that Theodore's decision represented not merely an economic calculation but a deliberate demonstration of his power to destroy lives whenever his interests or inclinations required such action. The sight of Patience struggling with heavy physical labor while living in conditions that provided no protection from winter weather became a daily reminder of the fundamental vulnerability that affected all enslaved people regardless of their apparent security or value to their owners. The medical neglect that accelerated Patience's decline reflected another aspect of Theodore's calculated approach to slave management, as providing health care for slaves required expenses that reduced profitability while offering no guarantee of preserving property values. Patience's obvious illness was attributed to natural weakness rather than the harsh conditions that had been imposed upon her, allowing Theodore to avoid responsibility for her deteriorating health while also reinforcing his narrative about the inherent fragility of enslaved people who required constant supervision and control. Isabella's attempts to provide care for her mother were limited by her own duties and the restrictions that prevented her from redirecting resources from her assigned tasks to personal concerns. The cruel irony of being required to maintain Theodore's comfortable environment while watching her mother suffer in conditions that could have been easily ameliorated had Theodore chosen to show even minimal compassion became a source of psychological torment that fundamentally altered Isabella's understanding of her relationship with the Whitmore family. Patience's death during a particularly harsh cold spell in January 1845 provided the final confirmation that Isabella needed about the true nature of slavery and the impossibility of achieving security or dignity through compliance and loyalty. Her mother's funeral was a simple affair conducted according to the minimal requirements that Theodore considered appropriate for enslaved people, with no acknowledgement of Patience's decades of faithful service or the valuable contributions she had made to the household's smooth operation. Emotional devastation that Isabella experienced following her mother's death was compounded by her recognition that similar fates awaited anyone who allowed themselves to become dependent on their owner's goodwill or who believed that exceptional service might provide protection against arbitrary cruelty. This understanding had destroyed any remaining illusions Isabella might have harbored about the possibility of finding happiness or security within the constraints of slavery, forcing her to confront the reality that survival required different strategies than those her mother had taught her. The transformation of Isabella's worldview following Patience's death had been gradual but comprehensive, affecting not only her understanding of her own situation but also her perception of Theodore's character and the psychological mechanisms that sustained his authority. She had begun to see past his cultured exterior to recognize the fundamental brutality that underlay all his relationships with enslaved people, understanding that his apparent kindness or consideration were merely tools for maintaining control rather than expressions of genuine human concern. The knowledge that Theodore had deliberately chosen to destroy her mother's life as part of a business decision designed to reduce operating expenses had created hatred so profound that it required tremendous self-control to conceal from observation. Isabella had learned to channel this rage into careful observation and strategic thinking, using her intimate access to Theodore's private life to identify vulnerabilities that might eventually be exploited for purposes that extended far beyond simple revenge to encompass a form of justice that would honor her mother's memory while also protecting other innocent people from similar fates. Part 8. Escalating Loss. The months following Patience's death had brought additional losses that compounded Isabella's grief while simultaneously hardening her resolve to take action against the system that had destroyed her family. Samuel's deteriorating condition under the brutal regimen of warehouse work represented the most immediate threat to Isabella's remaining emotional connections, as she watched her 16-year-old brother struggle with physical demands that were breaking his spirit as surely as they were damaging his body. Samuel's assignment to the cotton warehouses had occurred as part of the same cost-cutting measures that had eliminated Patience's position, with Theodore deciding that the young man's intelligence and literacy made him suitable for inventory management tasks that required both physical strength and basic computational skills. This position had initially seemed like an opportunity for Samuel to demonstrate his value while avoiding the harshest forms of field labor, but the reality of warehouse work had proven far more demanding and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The cotton warehouses that served Theodore's shipping operations were vast structures designed to store thousands of bales while they awaited transport to northern mills or international buyers. The work of moving these heavy bales required teams of enslaved men working in carefully coordinated groups, with any mistake potentially resulting in serious injury or death from shifting cargo. The pressure to maximize productivity while minimizing loading times created an atmosphere of constant stress that was exacerbated by the presence of white overseers who used violence to maintain the rapid pace that Theodore's business schedule required. Samuel's natural intelligence had made him valuable for inventory tracking and quality assessment tasks that required him to work closely with white supervisors who viewed his literacy skills with suspicion and resentment. These men interpreted Samuel's ability to read and write as evidence of dangerous aspirations that needed to be suppressed through regular demonstrations of their authority and his subservience. The resulting harassment had created psychological pressure that complemented the physical demands of warehouse work to create conditions that were destroying Samuel's health and spirit. Isabella's limited ability to protect her brother from these conditions had become a source of constant anguish that affected every aspect of her daily life. Her position as head house slave provided her with certain privileges and influence, but these advantages were meaningless when it came to intervening in decisions about field assignments or warehouse duties that fell under the authority of overseers who answered directly to Theodore rather than working through household management hierarchies. The physical changes that Isabella observed in Samuel during their brief weekly meetings had documented the progressive deterioration that warehouse work was causing to his body and spirit. The confident young man who had once shared her hopes for finding ways to improve their circumstances had been replaced by someone who moved with the careful caution of someone in constant pain, whose eyes had lost their natural brightness, and whose conversation focused increasingly on immediate survival rather than future possibilities. The emotional distance that had developed between Isabella and Samuel reflected not only the physical separation imposed by their different work assignments but also the psychological barriers that extreme stress created between people who loved each other but lacked the resources to provide meaningful support. Samuel's attempts to shield Isabella from knowledge about the worst aspects of his situation had created a painful irony, as his desire to protect her from additional worry had prevented her from fully understanding the urgency of his need for intervention. Isabella's growing awareness of Samuel's deteriorating condition had coincided with her recognition that Theodore's cost-cutting measures were part of a broader pattern of increasing exploitation that would eventually affect every enslaved person at Magnolia Heights. The financial pressures that had triggered these changes showed no signs of diminishing, and Theodore's satisfaction with the results of his efficiency improvements suggested that further reductions in slave welfare were likely to follow as he continued to search for ways to maximize profitability. The knowledge that Samuel's current suffering represented only the beginning of what Theodore was prepared to inflict on his enslaved workforce had provided additional motivation for Isabella's developing plans for resistance. She understood that individual intervention on Samuel's behalf might provide temporary relief but would not address the fundamental conditions that made such exploitation inevitable under the existing system of power relationships. The broader community of enslaved people at Magnolia Heights had begun to show signs of stress and desperation that reflected the cumulative impact of Theodore's cost-cutting measures on their collective welfare. Food rations had been reduced to minimal subsistence levels, medical care had been further restricted to emergency treatment only, and living conditions had deteriorated as maintenance resources were redirected to profit-generating activities rather than slave welfare. These changing conditions had created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that affected everyone's behavior, with people becoming more cautious about expressing dissatisfaction or seeking help for problems that might be interpreted as challenges to authority. The informal networks of mutual support that had previously provided emotional and practical assistance during difficult times had been weakened by people's need to focus on their own survival and their fear that association with others' problems might result in additional punishment or unwanted attention from overseers. Isabella's position as head house slave had made her a natural focal point for community concerns and anxieties, but it had also isolated her from the kind of close personal relationships that might have provided emotional support during her own period of grief and planning. Her awareness that other people viewed her as someone who might be able to influence Theodore's decisions had created pressure to maintain hope and confidence that she no longer felt, while her knowledge of Theodore's true character made it impossible for her to offer the reassurance that people desperately needed. The psychological burden of carrying other people's hopes while dealing with her own trauma and developing her plans for resistance had created internal pressure that Isabella recognized was approaching unsustainable levels. The careful emotional control that had allowed her to maintain her facade of loyalty while observing Theodore's vulnerabilities required tremendous energy that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain as external pressures continued to mount. Ruth's growing concern about Isabella's emotional state had led to increasingly direct conversations about the dangers of allowing grief and anger to overwhelm the caution that survival required. The older woman's experience had taught her to recognize the signs that indicated when someone was approaching the breaking point where desperation might lead to actions that would result in catastrophic consequences for both the individual and the broader community. The delicate balance between maintaining hope for eventual liberation and accepting the immediate reality of powerlessness had become increasingly difficult for Isabella to navigate as she watched the continued deterioration of conditions for people she cared about. Her developing plans for resistance represented an attempt to resolve this tension by taking action that would address both her personal need for justice and the broader community's need for protection from further exploitation. The recognition that her window of opportunity for effective action was limited by both external circumstances and her own psychological resources had begun to influence the timing and methods that Isabella was considering for her eventual confrontation with Theodore. The approaching social season would provide cover and distraction, but it would also represent her last chance to act before the accumulated stress of her situation made decisive action impossible to execute with the precision that success would require. Part 9. First Response. The opportunity that Isabella had been waiting for arrived during the early spring of 1847 when Theodore's business associate Harold Pemberton suffered a mysterious accident while visiting another plantation near Augusta. Pemberton had been traveling to inspect cotton warehouses when his horse apparently threw him, resulting in injuries severe enough to prevent him from continuing his journey. The incident might have remained unremarkable except for certain details that created doubt about whether the fall had been entirely accidental. Pemberton's reputation for cruelty toward enslaved people had made him notorious throughout the region, with stories circulating about punishment methods that exceeded even the brutal standards considered normal among plantation owners. His practice of using branding irons to mark slaves who displeased him had earned him the hatred of enslaved communities across multiple counties, while his financial success had protected him from criticism by white authorities who viewed his methods as effective property management. Isabella learned about Pemberton's accident through correspondence that Theodore received from business associates who were attempting to determine whether the incident would affect shipping schedules and cotton delivery commitments. The letters contained disturbing details about the discovery of Pemberton's body, which had been found in circumstances that suggested his horse might have been deliberately spooked rather than simply startled by natural causes. The investigation into Pemberton's death had been conducted by local authorities who were more interested in maintaining social stability than uncovering uncomfortable truths about slave resistance. The official conclusion that the incident represented an unfortunate accident satisfied white authorities while leaving enslaved communities throughout the region with the understanding that justice had been served through channels that operated beyond the formal legal system. Theodore's reaction to news of Pemberton's death revealed anxieties about his own security that he had previously kept hidden from even his closest associates. His immediate decision to review safety protocols at Magnolia Heights included new restrictions on slave movement, increased surveillance during business meetings, and instructions to overseers about identifying potential security threats among the enslaved population. Isabella observed Theodore's heightened vigilance with carefully concealed satisfaction, recognizing that his fear represented the first crack in the facade of absolute confidence that had previously characterized his demeanor. The knowledge that even the most powerful slaveholders could be brought down by their own human property had provided inspiration while also demonstrating that individual action could have consequences that extended far beyond immediate targets. The changes in household security that Theodore implemented following Pemberton's death created new challenges for Isabella's daily routine while also providing opportunities to test methods that might prove useful for her own evolving plans. The requirement that all slaves report their locations at specified intervals created additional work but also established patterns that could potentially be exploited by someone who understood the system well enough to identify its vulnerabilities. Benjamin's role in implementing some of these security measures had given him access to information about Theodore's concerns and precautions that proved valuable for understanding how the plantation owner's mind worked under pressure. His reports to Isabella about conversations he had overheard between Theodore and the overseers revealed that the plantation owner was becoming increasingly paranoid about potential threats from within his own enslaved workforce. The psychological impact of Pemberton's death on Theodore's behavior had manifested in subtle changes that Isabella observed during her daily interactions with him in his private study. His previously methodical approach to business correspondence had become hurried and anxious, with frequent consultations of his pocket watch that suggested growing discomfort with the amount of time he spent alone with enslaved people who had access to his personal spaces. Theodore's increased reliance on his pocket watch as a source of psychological comfort had made the timepiece even more central to his daily routine, with the ritual of consulting and adjusting it becoming more frequent and elaborate. Isabella noticed that he now held the watch for longer periods while reviewing correspondence, running his fingers along the gold chain in a repetitive pattern that seemed to provide reassurance during moments of particular stress or uncertainty. The timing of Pemberton's death had coincided with Theodore's preparations for the spring social season, creating additional pressure as he attempted to maintain normal business relationships while dealing with his private anxieties about security. His determination to proceed with planned entertainments despite his concerns about slave resistance had created opportunities for Isabella to observe his behavior under circumstances that revealed previously hidden aspects of his character. Ruth's growing awareness of Isabella's interest in details about Theodore's security concerns had led to careful conversations about the dangers of allowing curiosity about white people's fears to become too obvious. The older woman's experience had taught her that enslaved people who appeared too interested in their owners' vulnerabilities often found themselves subjected to increased scrutiny that could lead to discovery of activities or thoughts that should remain hidden. Isabella's careful management of her own behavior during this period had required tremendous self-discipline, as her growing excitement about the possibilities suggested by Pemberton's death had to be balanced against the need to maintain her facade of innocent compliance. The knowledge that Theodore was becoming increasingly vulnerable to actions by enslaved people who possessed detailed knowledge of his routines and psychology had made it difficult to conceal her satisfaction with recent developments. The correspondence that Isabella handled during the weeks following Pemberton's death had revealed that similar incidents were occurring at other plantations throughout the region, suggesting that individual acts of resistance were becoming more common as enslaved people recognized opportunities to challenge their oppressors. Theodore's awareness of this pattern had contributed to his growing paranoia while also providing Isabella with evidence that she was not alone in her determination to take action against systematic brutality. The network of communication that existed among enslaved people across different plantations had begun carrying information about successful resistance activities, along with warnings about increased security measures and surveillance techniques that owners were implementing in response to perceived threats. Isabella's access to this informal intelligence network had provided her with valuable insights about methods that had proven effective while also alerting her to risks that needed to be avoided. Benjamin's emotional response to news about Pemberton's death had revealed the depth of his own hatred for the plantation system and his willingness to support actions that challenged white authority. His careful questions about Isabella's thoughts on recent events had suggested that he was prepared to provide assistance for activities that might require coordination and mutual support between trusted individuals. The transformation in Theodore's behavior following Pemberton's death had also affected his relationships with his children, as his increased anxiety about security had made him more controlling and suspicious in his interactions with family members. Catherine's continued sympathy for enslaved people had become a source of particular concern for Theodore, who now viewed his daughter's attitudes as potential security risks that required careful monitoring and correction. Marcus's reaction to his father's heightened security concerns had been to increase his own cruelty toward enslaved people, apparently believing that additional brutality would serve as an effective deterrent to resistance activities. This escalation in violence had created additional suffering for the enslaved community, while also providing Isabella with further evidence that the Whitmore family's response to threats would be to intensify rather than moderate their oppressive behavior. The spring weather that was beginning to warm the Georgia countryside had created conditions that would soon make extended outdoor activities more comfortable, while also providing cover for movements that required privacy and concealment. Isabella recognized that the combination of seasonal changes, increased security concerns, and Theodore's psychological vulnerability had created circumstances that might not occur again, making the approaching weeks crucial for any actions that required optimal timing and preparation. Part 10. Catalyst Moment. The arrival of Catherine's childhood friend Margaret Sinclair from Philadelphia in early April 1847 introduced a volatile element into the already tense atmosphere at Magnolia Heights. As the young woman's Northern education and abolitionist sympathies created immediate friction with Theodore's carefully maintained social order. Margaret's presence represented more than simply an inconvenient houseguest. She embodied ideas and attitudes that directly challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which Theodore's entire world was constructed. Margaret had grown up in Philadelphia's Quaker community, where opposition to slavery was considered a moral imperative rather than a political position, and her education had included extensive exposure to abolitionist literature and speakers who had shaped her understanding of human dignity and social justice. Her friendship with Catherine dated to their shared attendance at the Charleston Female Seminary, but Margaret's subsequent education in Philadelphia had taken her in directions that Catherine was only beginning to explore. The conversations between Catherine and Margaret that Isabella overheard while serving in the main house revealed the existence of organized networks dedicated to undermining slavery through both legal and extra-legal means. Margaret spoke casually about Underground Railroad activities, anti-slavery publications that were being circulated throughout the South, and political developments in Washington that suggested growing Northern opposition to slavery's expansion into new territories. Theodore's reaction to Margaret's presence had been carefully controlled during formal social interactions, but Isabella observed signs of profound discomfort in his private moments that suggested the young woman's influence on Catherine was creating anxiety that extended far beyond simple parental concern. His consultation of his pocket watch had become almost compulsive whenever Margaret was present, with the familiar ritual appearing to provide psychological anchoring during conversations that challenged his fundamental beliefs. The political implications of Margaret's visit extended beyond the immediate household to affect Theodore's business relationships and social standing within Savannah's merchant community. Her presence at Magnolia Heights was being noted by other slaveholders who viewed any association with Northern abolitionists as potentially dangerous to the stability of their own operations, creating pressure on Theodore to demonstrate his continued commitment to pro-slavery principles. Isabella's access to Theodore's correspondence during this period had revealed the extent to which Margaret's visit was affecting his business relationships, with several associates expressing concern about the wisdom of hosting someone whose political views were known to be hostile to Southern institutions. These letters had created additional stress for Theodore, who recognized that his daughter's friendship choices were beginning to affect his commercial reputation in ways that could have serious financial consequences. The social events that Theodore had planned for the spring season were complicated by Margaret's presence, as her attendance at gatherings with other prominent slaveholders created potential for confrontations that could damage Theodore's carefully cultivated relationships. His attempts to control the topics of conversation during these events had become increasingly obvious and desperate, revealing his awareness that Margaret possessed both the knowledge and inclination to challenge slavery's moral foundations in ways that could prove deeply embarrassing. Catherine's growing confidence in expressing anti-slavery opinions had been emboldened by Margaret's support and encouragement, creating family tensions that were beginning to affect the entire household. Isabella observed that Theodore's patience with his daughter's moral awakening was rapidly approaching exhaustion, and she recognized that a crisis between father and daughter was inevitable unless one of them modified their position significantly. The informal discussions that took place among the enslaved population about Margaret's presence had revealed complex feelings about the young woman's abolitionist commitments and their potential impact on conditions at Magnolia Heights. While many appreciated her obvious sympathy for their circumstances, others worried that her influence on Catherine might provoke Theodore to implement harsher controls as a demonstration of his continued authority over his human property. Benjamin's interest in Margaret's presence had been particularly intense, as his position caring for horses and carriages had given him opportunities to overhear conversations between the young women that revealed specific details about underground railroad operations and escape routes that might prove valuable for future reference. His careful questioning of Isabella about whether Margaret's visit might create opportunities for resistance activities had suggested that he was prepared to take risks if circumstances seemed favorable. Ruth's concern about the potential consequences of Margaret's visit had led to increasingly direct warnings about the dangers of allowing hope for external assistance to override the caution that survival required. The older woman's experience had taught her that periods of political tension often resulted in increased brutality toward enslaved people as owners sought to demonstrate their control and authority in the face of perceived challenges. The changes in household routine that Margaret's visit required had created additional opportunities for Isabella to observe Theodore's behavior under stress while also providing cover for activities that might otherwise attract unwanted attention. The increased social activity that accompanied Margaret's presence had made it easier for enslaved people to move around the estate and engage in private conversations without arousing suspicion from overseers who were focused on maintaining proper appearances for the northern visitor. Isabella's growing understanding of the political currents that Margaret's visit had brought to Magnolia Heights had influenced her thinking about the broader context within which her personal plans for resistance would unfold. The knowledge that slavery was facing increasing challenges from multiple directions had provided additional motivation for individual actions while also suggesting that the timing of such actions might affect their symbolic significance and practical consequences. The psychological pressure that Theodore was experiencing as a result of Margaret's visit had begun to manifest in changes to his daily routine that Isabella observed with growing interest. His morning ritual with the pocket watch had become more elaborate and time-consuming, suggesting that the familiar object was providing crucial emotional support during a period of unusual stress and uncertainty about his ability to maintain control over his environment. Margaret's direct questions about slave treatment and her obvious horror at some of the stories she heard had created situations where Theodore was forced to defend practices that he normally took for granted, revealing aspects of his character and reasoning that were usually hidden beneath his polished social exterior. Isabella's presence during some of these conversations had given her insights into Theodore's psychological vulnerabilities that would prove crucial for her developing plans. The tension between Margaret's moral certainty and Theodore's defensive rationalization had created an atmosphere of barely contained conflict that was affecting everyone in the household, from family members who were forced to navigate increasingly difficult conversations to enslaved people who recognized that they were likely to bear the consequences of any resolution to the growing crisis between competing worldviews. Catherine's obvious internal struggle between loyalty to her family and her growing conviction that slavery was morally indefensible had created opportunities for Isabella to observe how moral awakening developed among white people who had been raised to accept human bondage as natural and necessary. This knowledge had influenced Isabella's understanding of the psychological mechanisms that sustained slavery while also suggesting potential strategies for challenging those mechanisms through carefully planned actions. The approaching end of Margaret's visit had created urgency for all parties involved, as everyone recognized that her departure would force resolution of tensions that had been building throughout her stay. Theodore's obvious relief at the prospect of her leaving was balanced by his concern about the lasting influence she might have on Catherine's thinking, while Catherine's awareness that her friend's departure would end their mutual support for challenging family orthodoxy had made her increasingly desperate to find ways to continue their shared commitment to anti-slavery principles. Part 11. Plan Execution. The opportunity that Isabella had been preparing for finally materialized on the evening of April 23, 1847, when Theodore's carefully orchestrated dinner party for visiting cotton merchants created the perfect convergence of distraction, timing, and access that her plan required. The gathering included 6 prominent businessmen from Savannah and Charleston along with their wives, creating an atmosphere of social obligation that demanded Theodore's complete attention while providing plausible explanations for any unusual activity in the household's normally rigid routine. The extensive preparations required for entertaining guests of such social and commercial importance had created legitimate reasons for Isabella to spend additional time in Theodore's private study, arranging documents and personal effects to create the impression of effortless organization that would reinforce his reputation for meticulous attention to detail. These preparations had also required her to handle Theodore's most precious possessions, including the gold pocket watch, with even greater frequency than usual, as she ensured that every aspect of his personal space reflected the refined elegance that his business relationships required. Margaret's departure 3 days earlier had left Catherine in a state of emotional turmoil that created additional household tension while also providing Isabella with crucial intelligence about the family's psychological dynamics. Catherine's obvious distress at losing her ally in challenging slavery had made her more reckless in expressing anti-slavery sentiments, forcing Theodore to expend considerable energy managing his daughter's behavior while preparing for the evening's critical business negotiations. The dinner conversation had proceeded according to Theodore's careful planning, with discussions focusing on cotton prices, shipping schedules, and political developments that might affect trade relationships. However, Catherine's presence at the gathering had introduced unexpected complications when she began asking pointed questions about slave treatment that made the assembled businessmen uncomfortable and forced Theodore to defend practices that were normally taken for granted among people who shared similar economic interests. Isabella's role in serving the elaborate meal had provided her with opportunities to observe the psychological pressure that Catherine's questions were creating for Theodore, whose consultation of his pocket watch had become almost constant as he struggled to maintain his composure while redirecting conversation away from topics that might damage his carefully cultivated reputation. The familiar ritual of checking the timepiece had clearly become a crucial source of emotional anchoring during moments of particular stress. Benjamin's assigned responsibilities for managing the carriages and horses of the visiting guests had positioned him perfectly to monitor activity around the estate while also providing early warning of any unexpected arrivals or departures that might interfere with Isabella's carefully planned timeline. His signals through the kitchen window had confirmed that all guests remained focused on their dining and conversation, creating the extended period of distraction that Isabella's plan required. The moment of action came during the brief interval when Theodore excused himself from his guests to retrieve additional documents from his study, a routine that Isabella had observed dozens of times and had incorporated into her planning with meticulous attention to timing and positioning. Theodore's habit of consulting his watch immediately upon entering his private space had provided the perfect opportunity for Isabella to position herself where she could act with maximum effect while minimizing the risk of interruption or discovery. Theodore's surprise at finding Isabella in his study was quickly replaced by irritation at what he perceived as unauthorized presence in his private space, but his immediate focus on retrieving the needed documents prevented him from questioning her presence until it was too late for such inquiries to matter. His automatic reach for the pocket watch to check the time represented the final element that Isabella needed to execute the plan she had been refining for months. The gold chain that had symbolized Theodore's power and precision for so many years became the instrument of his destruction with an efficiency that reflected Isabella's intimate knowledge of both the object itself and Theodore's psychological dependence upon it. Her years of handling the chain during daily cleaning rituals had given her complete familiarity with its weight, flexibility, and precise mechanics, while her observation of Theodore's emotional relationship with the timepiece had revealed the symbolic significance that made this particular method of execution both practically effective and psychologically devastating. The struggle was brief but decisive, with Theodore's shock at the betrayal by someone he had trusted completely preventing him from mounting effective resistance against an attack that combined physical force with psychological warfare. Isabella's positioning behind his chair had given her tactical advantages that Theodore's age and surprise made impossible to overcome, while the choice of weapon ensured that his own most treasured possession became the instrument of justice for crimes that had gone unpunished for too long. Theodore's final moments were marked by recognition of the profound irony that his destruction had been accomplished using the very symbol of his authority and control wielded by hands that he had trained to serve his every need with unquestioning loyalty. The gold chain that had measured his power over time and human lives had become the mechanism through which time ran out for someone whose victims had waited years for justice that the legal system would never provide. The practical considerations that followed Theodore's death required implementation of the concealment strategies that Isabella had been planning with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized her approach to the execution itself. The positioning of Theodore's body to suggest natural causes, the careful arrangement of the study to support that narrative, and the precise timing required to return to her normal duties without arousing suspicion had all been rehearsed mentally until they could be executed with automatic precision. Isabella's return to the dining room to continue serving Theodore's guests required a performance of concerned confusion when his prolonged absence was noticed, followed by the carefully orchestrated discovery of his apparently lifeless form slumped over his desk in a position that suggested sudden illness rather than violent death. Her screams of shock and distress were genuine expressions of the emotional release that followed months of careful planning and psychological preparation, though their apparent cause was the opposite of their actual significance. The immediate response to Theodore's apparent death involved summoning Dr. Caldwell, whose examination of the body focused on identifying natural causes for the sudden demise of a man who had shown no obvious signs of serious illness. The doctor's conclusion that Theodore had suffered a fatal stroke or heart attack satisfied the assembled guests while providing the official explanation that would prevent detailed investigation into circumstances that might reveal uncomfortable truths about the relationship between oppressor and oppressed. Benjamin's role in maintaining normal stable operations while the household dealt with the crisis had positioned him to observe the reactions of guests and family members to Theodore's death, providing Isabella with crucial intelligence about whether her actions had aroused any suspicion. His subtle confirmation that no one questioned the official explanation of natural causes had allowed Isabella to begin planning for the period of uncertainty that would follow as the family and community adjusted to life without Theodore's controlling presence. The emotional reactions of Theodore's family to his sudden death had revealed the complex feelings that his authoritarian management had created even among those who benefited from his success. Catherine's obvious relief at being freed from her father's psychological pressure had been carefully concealed beneath appropriate expressions of grief, while Marcus's immediate concern about inheritance and business control had suggested that Theodore's death might create opportunities for changes in plantation management that could affect the entire enslaved community. Part 12. Concealment Phase. The period immediately following Theodore's death required Isabella to maintain her facade of loyal grief while carefully managing evidence that might suggest alternative explanations for his sudden demise. The gold pocket watch chain that had served as the murder weapon was returned to its customary position with meticulous attention to recreating the exact arrangement that Theodore had preferred, ensuring that no physical evidence remained to contradict the narrative of natural death that Dr. Caldwell had provided to satisfy official requirements. Isabella's performance of devastated servitude during the funeral preparations had been enhanced by genuine emotions that made her grief appear completely authentic to observers who lacked knowledge of its true sources. Her tears were real expressions of relief and satisfaction at having achieved justice for her mother's death and protection for her brother's future, though they were interpreted by sympathetic whites as evidence of the profound loyalty that Theodore had supposedly inspired in his most trusted domestic servant. The elaborate funeral arrangements that befitted a man of Theodore's social and commercial standing had created numerous opportunities for Isabella to observe the reactions of community members to his death while also gathering intelligence about potential challenges to the official explanation of natural causes. The absence of any expressions of suspicion about the circumstances of Theodore's demise had provided confirmation that her concealment strategies had been successful in preventing detection of evidence that might have led to dangerous investigations. Marcus's immediate assumption of authority over the plantation's operations had created changes in household routine that Isabella carefully monitored for their potential impact on her security and the welfare of other enslaved people. The young man's inexperience and natural cruelty had made him susceptible to manipulation by overseers and business associates who sought to influence his decisions, creating uncertainty about the future direction of plantation management that required careful navigation. Catherine's transformation following her father's death had been dramatic and immediate, with the young woman's suppressed abolitionist sympathies emerging in ways that created both opportunities and dangers for the enslaved community. Her newfound authority within the household had enabled her to implement changes in slave treatment that provided immediate relief from some of Theodore's harshest policies, but her obvious anti-slavery sentiments had also attracted attention from community members who viewed such attitudes as threats to regional stability. The business relationships that had sustained Theodore's commercial empire required careful management during the transition period as partners and competitors assessed whether Marcus possessed the competence necessary to maintain his father's level of success. Isabella's continued role in managing correspondence and administrative details had given her access to these business communications while also providing opportunities to influence outcomes through subtle manipulation of information and scheduling. Ruth's growing awareness that something fundamental had changed in Isabella's demeanor had led to increasingly direct conversations about the need to maintain emotional equilibrium during periods of transition that might create temptations to reveal information or attitudes that should remain hidden. The older woman's concern about Isabella's psychological state had been balanced by her recognition that Theodore's death had created possibilities for improved conditions that had not existed while he lived. Benjamin's emotional response to Theodore's death had revealed the depth of his feelings for Isabella while also demonstrating his growing understanding of the risks that her actions had entailed. His careful questions about her well-being during the stressful period following the funeral had suggested that he suspected more than he was willing to acknowledge directly, creating the need for Isabella to manage his curiosity while maintaining the secrecy that her continued safety required. The investigation that Sheriff Morrison had conducted into Theodore's death had been perfunctory and focused primarily on confirming Dr. Caldwell's medical conclusions rather than exploring alternative explanations that might have created uncomfortable questions about plantation security and slave management. Morrison's interviews with household members had followed standard procedures but lacked the intensity that would have been applied if any suspicion of foul play had been present. Isabella's testimony to Sheriff Morrison about the evening of Theodore's death had been carefully crafted to support the narrative of natural causes while providing plausible explanations for her presence in areas of the house where she might not normally have been found. Her description of Theodore's behavior during his final evening had emphasized signs of stress and fatigue that were consistent with medical conditions that might cause sudden death while avoiding any details that might suggest the presence of external threats. The community's response to Theodore's death had reflected the complex feelings that his authoritarian management style had generated even among white associates who had benefited from business relationships with him. While public expressions of sympathy and respect were appropriate and expected, private conversations had revealed that many people felt relief at the passing of someone whose success had been achieved through methods that made others uncomfortable even when they supported similar objectives. The economic disruption that Theodore's death created in regional cotton markets had provided additional evidence of his importance to the commercial networks that sustained slavery throughout the area. The temporary uncertainty about contracts and shipping arrangements had created opportunities for competitors to gain market share while also demonstrating the vulnerability of economic systems that depended on individual relationships rather than institutional structures. Isabella's access to information about these business disruptions had given her insights into the broader economic context within which her actions had occurred, revealing that individual resistance could have consequences that extended far beyond immediate targets to affect entire commercial networks. This knowledge had provided additional satisfaction while also suggesting that her actions might inspire similar resistance activities by other enslaved people who recognized new possibilities for challenging their oppressors. The changes in household management that followed Theodore's death had created opportunities for Isabella to consolidate her influence over domestic operations while also providing better protection for vulnerable community members like Samuel. Her subtle guidance of Catherine's reform initiatives had ensured that improvements in slave welfare were implemented in ways that avoided arousing suspicion about their true origins while maximizing their benefit for people who had suffered under Theodore's harsh policies. The religious services that commemorated Theodore's life had provided Isabella with opportunities to observe community reactions to his death while also offering occasions for private reflection on the moral dimensions of her actions. Her participation in these services had required careful management of her emotional responses to prayers and eulogies that praised virtues that she knew Theodore had not possessed, while also providing spiritual context for understanding her role in bringing justice to someone whose crimes had gone unpunished for too long. The legal procedures that governed inheritance and estate management had created administrative complexities that Isabella monitored carefully for their potential impact on the future of enslaved people at Magnolia Heights. The distribution of Theodore's property according to his will had included specific provisions for certain domestic servants that reflected his belief in their loyalty and value, creating ironies that only Isabella fully appreciated as she prepared for whatever future arrangements might emerge from the settlement of his estate. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.